as the world continues to wait to find out when is the meeting between Trump and Putin going to take place, or at least when are negotiations going to officially begin between the Trump administration and the Putin administration, we so far don't have anything, but we do have more comments because apparently Putin is not content to just sit and wait and see what happens. He's kind of taken some preemptive actions on the in terms of giving interviews. Here's one he gave curiously in the back of a car while he was going somewhere else yesterday. Then we're going to talk about some of that. And then we're going to look at the other half of that equation, at least in terms of the battlefield negotiations. And that's, what is the Zelensky regime saying? What are they talking about? So you're going to see a couple of dueling presidents talking here. And the problem is you've only got one actual reality on the ground. And we're going to see who is more closely aligned to what is really going on the ground, and then how this may turn out. And to analyze this, we have one of our channel's most popular guests, and certainly the highest qualified in international relations, and that is Professor John Mearsheimer, international relations theorist, professor of political science at the University of Chicago. Professor, as always, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, I mean, I won't say this tongue in cheek, like, well, let's do a comparative analysis and see which leader is closest aligned to the truth. But I think you probably already know where this one's going to go. But it's important to see what people are saying here, because it's also, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the second part here, what the European leaders are actually saying and where they're staking themselves out to. And we'll talk about whether that makes sense or not. Let's start with Vladimir Putin first. In this first clip here, he's asked about the negotiations between Ukraine and can they have good faith discussions with the leader of Ukraine.
Zelensky says he's open to negotiations. Do you think it is possible to negotiate with him?
You can negotiate with anyone, but because of his illegality, he, Zelensky, has no right to sign anything. If he wants to take part in the negotiations, I will appoint people to conduct them. But as far as signing documents is concerned, everything should be done in such a way that lawyers confirm to us the legitimacy of those people who will be authorized by the Ukrainian state to sign these agreements.
And I'm sorry, I don't mean to degenerate here, but it sounds a little bit like a Batman movie, like, we are now going to find out what. So it's a new interpretive they've never used, at least in the West before, and that's kind of interesting. But I digress. But let's regress here. And one of the things he said in that first one that really stood out to me was he said he views negotiating with Zelensky to be an ambush because he said when he signed this decree, and I think it was October of 2022, that he said he prohibits everyone in Ukraine from negotiating with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is still in office. That still holds. That's still the law of the land. Though a couple of days ago, Zelensky said, oh, well, yeah, that doesn't really apply to me, just applies to them. Well, that may work for him, but Putin is saying, as a lawyer, as someone who's trained in the law, he sees that as a legal ambush, that if he signs a decree with any kind of an agreement with Zelensky, who's by according to him not a legitimate president because he went past his term of office, that he says maybe they can just get out of it later. How do you see that?
Well, I think a lot of this goes back to what happened at the end of the Cold War, when the Russians did not get a written and formal commitment that NATO would not expand. You have a situation here where in the negotiations, the key issue on the table is going to be that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO. And what Putin wants is he wants that written in stone. He wants that formalized. And the problem he has is that if Zelensky signs it, someone down the road can say, yes, he signed it, but he was not a legitimate president. Therefore, I, the new Ukrainian leader, can violate the agreement that Zelensky made. The same thing, by the way, is true with regard to Trump. Putin would like to get from Trump an agreement that's pushed through Congress, right, that says Ukraine will not become part of NATO. But of course, Trump can't do that. Trump can just make a promise to him. But the question is that promise worth much? Is that commitment worth much? And what Putin is looking for here is he's looking for legally solid agreements that lock in as much as possible the commitment by Ukraine and by the United States and by Western Europe not to expand NATO into Ukraine.
Now, President Putin had said in previous days before this interview here that he thinks that, yes, I can talk to anybody in Ukraine. He kind of said that here, but he said subsequently or previously that there has to be some kind of an election in Ukraine where about a leader that was elected by their people who has the authority of office. If he sticks with that, I mean, it seems pretty unlikely that any time in the foreseeable future that Ukraine is going to engage in such an election. What does that tell you about what the near future holds, regardless of whenever Trump talks to Putin? If Putin's saying we won't sign anything until you get a leader, and if Ukraine isn't even trying to get a leader right now, where does that leave us?
Well, I'm not sure it matters very much, because even if you talk about where the United States and Russia are on this issue, they're a great distance apart from each other in terms of reaching any sort of meaningful agreement. It's not like we're on the verge, we meaning the Americans, are on the verge of reaching an agreement with the Russians, and the only obstacle that stands in our way is Ukraine. That's not the case. The Americans and the Russians are miles apart, at least if you listen to Trump talk. So the fact that Ukraine is not in a position to satisfy Putin's demands just doesn't matter that much.
So what then, in the absence of that, though, if there's no one to sign, then what if Russia doesn't seem like then they would reach any kind of an agreement? So does that mean then that absent that kind of a leadership, they would simply just keep fighting?
Of course, they'd be crazy not to. I think the Russians now recognize that there's little chance. I'm not saying there's no chance, but there's little chance of getting an agreement with the Russians, with the Americans, much less the Ukrainians, in the near future. And therefore, this one's going to be settled on the battlefield. And they're pushing forward, and they're making it clear that they're willing to talk. But beyond that, there's just no movement here. And a lot of this, by the way, has to do with the fact that Trump has made all these remarkably foolish statements about how he's going to deal with the Russians and about what kind of shape the Russians are in. All of these are not designed, but are going to have the effect of making it harder than ever to get an agreement.
You know, and on that point, I've actually never heard so far in all the Trump comments from Trump, not from Kellogg or any of his other officials, what even the contours of what he expects in a deal. He keeps saying we're going to reach a deal. I think that Putin wants to make a deal, and et cetera, but no actual. Here's what I think a deal would look like. Do you think he has one? Do you think anybody on his staff has one? And if so, what might that look like?
It's very hard to say. I mean, almost everybody on his staff is a super hawk or has been a super hawk on Ukraine. And they all appear to believe that Russia is weak, that it's suffering enormous casualties on the battlefield, and that therefore Putin is anxious, not just willing, but is anxious to cut a deal so he can end this tragic war as soon as possible. But this description that these people have in their head of what the Russian situation looks like bears no resemblance to reality. So the idea that the Russians are desperate and we can slap them around and then ultimately do them a favor by giving them a deal that's pretty good for them, but not great, is, in my opinion, delusional. But that's where we are. So I see no evidence that either President Trump or any of his lieutenants have a viable plan or a workable plan in their heads that they can present to Putin that can serve as a meaningful basis of a negotiation.
Well, in fact, here is a recent comment that kind of along those lines. Here's what Trump has said.
You've called for a ceasefire in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin doesn't come to the table to negotiate with you, will you put additional sanctions on Russia?
Sounds likely.
And do you think that the war should be frozen currently along
the war should have never started? If you had a competent president, which you didn't, the war wouldn't have happened. The war in Ukraine would have never happened if I were president.
Are you going to keep sending weapons to Ukraine, or are you going to turn off the tap soon?
Well, we're looking at that. We're talking to Zelensky. We're going to be talking with President Putin very soon, and we'll see how it all happens.
Now, let me ask you specifically about that particular clip, because on the one hand, he said, as you put it, slap them around and make them come to a deal. But then in the second part of that, they were saying, they asked him, are you going to cut off the tap to Ukraine? Now, we know, at least from reports, that all aid to everybody except for Egypt and Israel has been put on hold. So apparently there's not going to be any new aid coming. But he hesitated when they asked him that, like, yeah, well, maybe. He certainly didn't go, oh, no, we'll keep that tap going. What does that tell you? And what does that tell both Zelensky? And we'll start off with Zelensky. What does that tell Zelensky, first of all?
Well, it tells Zelensky there's some possibility that American military aid, and we're talking here about military aid, will continue. For how long, who knows? But I think the Ukrainians worried, and many American policymakers worried, that when Trump came into office, he'd shut off the spigot right away, and there'd be no military aid flowing to Ukraine. That's not happening, and he's not saying that he's going to cut that flow of aid, military aid, into Ukraine anytime soon. I find this hardly surprising because I think the administration is feeling its way around in the dark at this point. They've only been in power for 1+ weeks, and they have to figure out how they're going to deal with this incredibly complicated subject. So it would have been irresponsible of him to say we're just simply going to cut off military aid. But the question is, what does this all look like moving forward? Because he ultimately would like to cut aid and wash America's hands of this conflict.
And I think that's probably evident with Putin himself. And so that's the second part of my question is, what would Vladimir Putin think when he saw that whole clip right there?
Well, I think that Putin has to understand that he can't take Trump's comments too seriously, at least for purposes of negotiating with Trump. I mean, Trump has made the argument that the Russians have suffered 100,000 dead in the war. The Russian economy is in shambles. And Trump is giving Putin and other listeners the impression that Russia is really weak. And then he's talking, of course, about imposing sanctions on the Russians and weakening their already weak economy even further. And he thinks that Putin, according to what Trump says, is anxious for a deal and will be thankful that Trump is going to pull his chestnuts out of the fire. This is all ridiculous, right? It has little to do with what's actually happening in the war. And I would imagine that Putin is just quietly laughing behind the scenes when he listens to Trump talk. And he'll talk to Trump, but unless Trump comes to grips with reality, you're not going to get a deal here. And that's why I was saying, and I think you agree, you're likely to see continued fighting.
Well, in fact, here is in that same interview, here's what Putin did say about his, the quote, Western sponsors of Ukraine, which I'm sure meant first and foremost Donald Trump.
If there is a desire on the part of their Western sponsors to achieve peace, well, the way is very simple. I once sent a corresponding signal about this. If there is a desire, everything is welcome. And then they will quickly find all legal ways to resolve legal issues, including the cancellation of this decree banning negotiations.
Now, in that second one there, let me ask you, he said that, the path is open. We're willing to talk about negotiations if the Western sponsors are serious. But other than the June 14th lines is what I refer to when Putin made that conversation or that declaration last summer, where it's all the administrative borders of the four zones, no NATO, independent Ukraine on the other side militarily, and of course Crimea. Other than that, I haven't heard anything about what Putin would think he would want. As best you can piece together from all the sources that you've had, what do you think that Putin is going to say? Here's my opening gambit.
Well, Putin said in that June 14th speech that the two key issues are Ukraine can't be in NATO, and Ukraine and the West have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed Crimea plus these 4 oblasts. But I think Putin has also made it clear that you're not going to get a deal unless the military capability of Ukraine is greatly reduced over time. In other words, the Russians don't want to be facing a formidable Ukrainian military, even if it's not in NATO or even if it doesn't have security links with the West. They want Ukraine to remain militarily weak. And by the way, during the Istanbul negotiations, and here we're going back to the March, April 2022 period, right after the war started, when in Istanbul, the Russians and the Ukrainians were negotiating, it was very clear at the time that the Russians were insisting that limits be put on the size and quality of the Ukrainian military. So that will be, I think, the third big issue that will have to be resolved to get some sort of meaningful peace agreement.
So, something like the German army after World War I was restricted to 100,000 personnel, something like that?
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly what Putin has in mind.
Well, yeah, well, we'll see how that's going to work out. Again, all of those comments there, one would think that looking at the battlefield and looking at the balance of power for the two sides and the ability to wage war, which I think is maybe more important than even the current line of contact, that would seem to be plausible. Him being able to get these issues that he wants through negotiations or through force of arms. Now let's look at the other half of the equation here. Now we have Zelensky, who's going to give his view of things. And at the end of this, we'll see how that lines up with ground truth reality. In this first clip here, we're going to have Volodymyr Zelensky saying that basically he's going to expose that Putin is afraid of Trump.
The rhetoric of President Trump, it wasn't simply severe, it was just and fair. And this is exactly what Putin is afraid of. He doesn't want strong Trump supporting Ukraine because it would be strong Ukraine.
So let's look at the first part of that. Is Putin really afraid of Trump?
No. Look, if Putin is going to be afraid of someone, that someone has to have a big stick that he or she can use against Russia and cause a significant amount of pain. And the question you want to ask yourself is, what is the big stick that Donald Trump has? What is Donald Trump going to do to the Russians that Joe Biden couldn't do to the Russians? We all know that if Joe Biden could have hurt Russia or hurt Putin more, he would have done that, right? He was deeply committed to doing everything he could to defeat Russia in Ukraine, but he had no big stick. And at this point, the stick that Biden has shrunk in size. So the stick that Biden has passed on to Trump is a tiny little stick. Sanctions. We've sanctioned the Russians out the gazoo. What more are we going to do with sanctions? We're going to give them more ATACMS. These ATACMS, first of all, we don't have many of them. Secondly, they're basically useless anyway. Are there any other magic weapons that we can have that can serve as a big stick? I don't think that's the case. All of this is to say Putin has no reason to be afraid of Trump. And furthermore, you want to remember, this is very important to understand, Trump wants to put an end to this war. He genuinely wants to end this war, and he wants to get the Americans out of it. So what we have here is a situation where, independent of Trump, the Russians are doing very well on the battlefield by almost all accounts. If you read the New York Times this morning, you read The Economist this morning, the stories make it very clear that the Russians are on a roll and Ukraine is in desperate straits. Then you factor in Trump, who wants to cut off the Ukrainians, who heavily depend on us, and walk away. The Ukrainians are doomed. There's no way the Russians don't come out on top. I've long argued they would win an ugly victory. There's going to be no real happy ending to this war for the Russians, but they are going to win the war. And this is going to result in a catastrophic defeat for Ukraine. It's just horrible to think what's happened to Ukraine and what's going to happen going forward. And it's also going to be a disaster for NATO and for the West.
And what do you make? And let me talk first of all about the Biden element of that discussion you just had. That I think it was about a week ago, and if I'm not mistaken, it was the Washington Post. They came out with the story that said, actually, it turns out that Biden, when he said for as long as it takes, never actually intended to defeat Russia because he was afraid that might result in going into World War III. But so he just basically kept a life support, enough funding, enough ammunition, weapons, etc., just enough to keep the war going so that it would, quote, hurt Russia. Do you think that's valid?
I'll tell you, it's a terribly distressing story to hear. This is the first I've heard it because I hadn't seen that Washington Post piece. First of all, it's good news in the sense that it tells you that Biden had the good sense not to push the Russians to the point where they would use nuclear weapons and possibly get us all incinerated. So in a way, I'm very glad to hear that. But at the same time, this is remarkably cynical when you think about what we're doing with the Ukrainians here. I mean, the devastation that has been inflicted on Ukraine as a result of this war is horrifying. And the idea that Joe Biden was just prolonging the war to inflict pain on the Russians and didn't really care about what's happening to Ukraine as a country and to all of those Ukrainians who were being killed is really a horrifying thought. And it just shows you just how bankrupt American policy has been from the beginning. And Danny, let me make just one other point. You know, Trump said that if he had been president, this war would not have happened. I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump for sure, but I actually think that's true. I think that Joe Biden did nothing to avoid this war, and you can make a very good case he made it happen. I think if Trump had been in the White House, the war would not have happened because Trump is not interested in fighting wars. And I think this war was eminently avoidable, right? And the reason we didn't avoid it was because of the foolish policy of the West, and in particular, the foolish policy of the United States in the form of Joe Biden and Britain in the form of Boris Johnson.
Yeah, and Gary, if you can take a look at that, I just emailed you the hit. Turned out it was in Time magazine. It wasn't in Washington Post. And yeah, and apparently that's at least that's what's being reported, that's exactly what he was doing, and Biden. And it's just, you know, it had no chance to succeed. Although from Biden's perspective, it was a success. I think when Gary is able to throw the headline up there, you'll see in a second. But it was Biden's Ukraine win was Zelensky's loss, and it went in there and talked about it in a number of things. And yeah, it is disturbing that that's what the administration considered a win, i.e., it didn't think that it was a mistake. It thought it was actually a success for America's perspective. But gracious, I mean, it doesn't take long to be able to say, hey, look, Secretary Austin's comment in the beginning of the war, I think by the summer, was that an objective of the U.S. was to weaken Russia. But can you make any argument, or rather, different question, can any argument rationally be made that Russia of February 2022 was stronger than the Russia of today?
No, it's unequivocally clear, in my opinion, that Russia today is stronger than it was in February 2022. And General Covelli, who is SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, an American general, has said that. The Russian army in February of 2022, when it invaded Ukraine, was a weak army. It was small in size, and the quality of the fighting forces was quite low. It was not an army that was configured for offense. It was not a cocked pistol. What's happened over time is that Putin has mobilized huge numbers of men who now serve in that military. They have been trained up. They have lots of combat experience. They have not been bled white by the Ukrainians. It's the Russians who've been bleeding the Ukrainians white. And the end result is that the Russian military is more formidable today than it was in 2022. And furthermore, in terms of the economy, I think one could make an argument that the economy today, the Russian economy, is in better shape than it was in 2022. So the idea that we won this war, even though the Ukrainians didn't win, is, I think, not a serious argument. Again, Russia is more powerful. And when we finally recognize that we have lost in Ukraine, it's going to be seen as a devastating defeat for the West. And that includes NATO, and that includes the United States. So the idea that we've won here is as foolish as arguing that Benjamin Netanyahu has won in Gaza. He didn't win in Gaza, and we're not going to win in Ukraine, despite the fact we spin all these stories in the media about great victories for whether it's Benjamin Netanyahu over in the Middle East or Zelensky and Biden here in the West.
Okay, well, with that setup, with all the stuff you just said there about the increasing it out of balance, out of whack, balance of power between the two sides, assess this comment from Zelensky, who's basically saying that he not only is Putin afraid of Trump, Trump can also force Putin into a good outcome.
President Trump has the will to force Putin to come to peace. He can do it. And if the U.S. considers pressure on Putin involving other countries, Global South and China, I'm sure that an agreement can be made. We need broader guarantees of security. If there are no joint guarantees, I believe that guarantees from Europe alone will never be enough.
Okay, let me take the last part of that comment first. I think in this sense, he's right. Guarantees, security guarantees from Europe is not going to be enough. But maybe a bigger question is anyone, and I mean any single or group of nations in Europe, willing to put their security on the line to guarantee Ukraine's security?
The answer is no. And we have a war that's been going on now for almost 3 years that provides evidence of that. And once the Americans are out of the equation and the Europeans are responsible for Ukraine, you're going to see less of a European commitment, not more of a European commitment to Ukraine. The Americans are the glue that holds the alliance together. And without the Americans, the Europeans are not going to come together. The collective action problems are just too big. So Ukraine is screwed. By the way, just listening to Zelensky talk, you can see why he has led his country to disaster. And it's just very important to understand that he has been the leader of Ukraine since this war broke out on February 24th, 2022. He is the one who walked away from the Istanbul negotiations. He is responsible for the disastrous consequences of this war. And when you listen to him talk today about what Donald Trump can do and what the Americans can do and how he thinks about Ukraine's situation moving forward, you know very quickly that this man is delusional. And the fact that he is delusional explains in good part why he has led his country to disaster since February 2022.
Well, and this next clip I'm going to have really just reinforces exactly what you're saying, and also introduces consonant dissonance, I think, in what he's saying he wants and what's even possible. Here he's going to be talking about, again, he's talking about security guarantees coming from European nations, but then he's going to talk at the end of this about previous agreements, to include the Budapest Memorandum, and I think it was 1992, and the Minsk agreements. Watch this.
Putin is not afraid of Europe. Unfortunately, that is so. And so we need such guarantees of security. And we talked about the mistake that Ukraine made at the time back because of that pressure from the United States and the Russian Federation when we gave away the nuclear weapons we had in exchange for that Budapest Memorandum, which gave us nothing. That Budapest Memorandum was just a piece of paper, same as the Minsk agreements.
So he has previously, Zelensky, I think in December, specifically cited the Minsk agreements and said, actually, you know what, this was Russia. They're the ones who screwed up the Minsk agreements and they didn't follow it here. If you're agreeing with this, if you're Zelensky and saying, yeah, the Budapest Memorandum didn't protect us, the Minsk agreements didn't protect us, then what possible guarantees would he be looking for that could protect him?
There just are no guarantees. Right. Look, I argued I was one of the few people on the entire planet outside of Ukraine who argued that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons in 1993. I was one of the few people who said
I remember that. Yeah, we've actually we've shown that headline up here before, and you were way out there. And people were thinking, "What is he talking about?" And boy, you're looking pretty good.
And by the way, Bill, there's a video on the internet you can watch where Bill Clinton admits that he was now wrong, forcing Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons.
Mm.
But the fact is, they gave up their nuclear weapons. The Budapest Memorandum was a meaningless piece of paper, as we now know. This is why I argued in 2014 that Ukraine should immediately give up on the idea of becoming a member of NATO, should immediately become a neutral state, right? Because there was no way another country could, number one, pull its chestnuts out of the fire, and number two, provide it with meaningful security guarantees moving forwards. The Russians just simply won't tolerate this. So it would have made much more sense for the Ukrainians to cut a deal with Russia. It would have been really a good idea if the Ukrainians, after the NATO 2008 decision to bring Ukraine into NATO, had said, this is not going to happen. We want no part of it. That would have been much better for Ukraine.
Yeah.
The fact is, in a very important way, the Ukrainians are in a terrible situation. They live next door to a great power that is far more powerful than them. They have no third country that they can really turn to provide meaningful security guarantees. So they have no choice but to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Russians. Is that going to make the Ukrainians happy? No. But the question is, what is the alternative? The alternative is what you see happening now. You pursue membership in NATO and you end up getting your country destroyed.
And so where do we go from here? I mean, I think any rational thinking person is going to see that the view of things that Zelensky is articulating and the view of things that Putin is articulating matches up on the ground with only one side, and that is with the Putin side here. So Zelensky can say whatever he wants. The incoming Trump, the Trump administration can say whatever it wants. But in the end, what is going to happen on the ground, and how is this going to be determined?
Well, what's going to happen on the ground if you don't get some sort of negotiated agreement is the Russians are just going to take more and more territory. I think at max, they'll take about 40% of Ukraine. I think they don't want to move too far west because then they'll be occupying territory that's filled with ethnic Ukrainians, and that will be a hellacious situation. But they're going to take, if they can, more territory than they now control. And I think the only thing you can do if you're playing Ukraine's hand or even the United States' hand is you can approach the Russians about cutting a deal where you accept that Ukraine will not be in NATO, that it will be a genuinely neutral country, that it won't be powerfully armed so as it threatens Russia, and you accept the fact that they now have annexed those 4 oblasts plus Crimea, but nothing more. I think that is the best deal you can get at this point in time. Is this a good deal? No, from a Ukrainian point or from an American point of view. I fully understand why the Ukrainians would recoil at this deal. But the question again is, what is the alternative? Is there a better alternative? And the answer is no, because we've gotten ourselves and gotten the Ukrainians into so much trouble at this point in time. So that's the only viable deal. But is it viable politically in the West or in Ukraine? I think you know well, Danny, the answer to that is no. So then you scratch your head and say, well, where does that leave us? And I think that tells me it's just hard to see what the political solution is here. And it looks like it's just going to play itself out on the battlefield and you're going to get a frozen conflict. Now, I want to say, I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope I'm wrong. I hope this is one of those cases where I'm spectacularly wrong. And actually, we managed to cut a deal that the Ukrainians can live with and that ends this horrendous war for the Ukrainians and even for the Russians. But I don't think that's going to happen, I'm sad to say.
And I want to talk about something. We had Colonel Jacques Beau on yesterday, a former NATO officer in Switzerland. Larry, I just sent you a full screen. If you could pop that up there here in just a second, as soon as you get a chance. One of the things that he revealed to us yesterday, that at least in Western world and media, is almost unknown at all. A lot of and I've talked to a lot of people here in Washington who think that Trump has an actual shot at negotiating the end of the war on the current line of conflict, because they say, well, look, you haven't been able to move beyond anything for a long time. It's taken 3 years for you to get in this map that we're showing here that was provided by Colonel Beau, that the red outline in the far right is the current line, what Russia currently possesses, what they occupy, and that the left side of that is the line of contact. Well, the second red line you see a little bit further up in there is something going all the way back to 2014, when there were a number of Ukrainian, basically rebel groups that had rebelled against the Ukraine side when they started the 2014, what turned out to be a civil war, and there was lots of military clashes against them. He's in the area between the bright red line and the darker red line to the other side of it. In the last number of months, especially the last 6 months, he's saying that there's more and more people rising up and forming groups that could then start a 2014 style Maidan kind of a situation inside Ukraine, on the Ukraine side of the line. So now Russia is putting more and more pressure on the line of contact with its conventional forces, and there are these other forces that are starting to line up to potentially cause partisan type warfare problems for the Ukraine side on the Ukraine line, which would further weaken their position. So it is not at all guaranteed, or even likely, I would argue, that the Ukraine side can continue to maintain this line of contact for any period of time. And I think this gets back to what you were saying a second ago, that Putin has no motivation, no incentive to come to an agreement that's going to weaken his own hand, much less a ceasefire, if he sees that the Ukraine line of contact itself is starting to weaken, and the area behind the line is starting to rise in power against Ukraine. It's going to work in his favor if he keeps going, because this thing could collapse faster than what anybody thinks, I believe.
I think that's true. I mean, there are all sorts of reports out of Ukraine that General Budanov, who's the head of Ukrainian intelligence, has said that at the most, Ukraine has another 6 months of fighting left in its army, and then it's all over with. I mean, the Ukrainian army is on the verge of collapse. And as I said before, you have to marry this fact with the fact that Donald Trump wants to cut them off. I mean, it's just hard to see how you could tell a happy story about the Ukrainian military standing up to the Russian military, after 4 or 5 more months. It looks like they're doomed to me. And if these stories are true, and I have no reason to doubt it, about insurgent movements, resistance forming inside of those Ukrainian occupied pieces of territory that are adjacent to the battlefield, then the Ukrainians are even in more trouble. And again, this is why it would make eminently good sense. And you and I have argued for a long time together. We argued this when we were a tag team at the Council on Foreign Relations last year, that it would make eminently good sense to cut a deal as quickly as possible. Eminently good sense for Ukraine. Who cares about the United States at this point in time? From Ukraine's point of view, they just ought to cut a deal, minimize their losses. But again, it's just very hard to sell that argument.
If I'm not mistaken, Professor, I think it was maybe a year or so ago, maybe a little bit less than that. I think it was the very first time you were actually on our show. You had suggested that Ukraine may not lose 4 provinces, but maybe 8. As it turns out, that map that I just showed you right there is pretty close to 8 provinces that you had talked about before that can still go. And so I think that the chances seem to be growing to that. And then let me just ask you in closing here, from the Ukrainian point of view, I saw that comment by Budanov, which he has since said, oh, that's not really what I meant, but it's out there. You can't undo that. People can't unsee those kinds of things. You have Trump, as we showed here before, hesitating and not refuting that he would continue to fund Ukraine and give them weapons and everything else, implying that he may not. If you're the Ukraine side and you know all of those facts on the battlefield, much more than what we know in the open source arena, and you see these comments by your own chief of their intelligence, by Trump coming in, and you know for sure he's trying to get a negotiated settlement, and you know where Putin's coming from. Where is your motivation to continue to ignore all of those realities and keep trying to go for something that's unrealistic? I don't see how this has any prospect for a good ending for Ukraine.
I agree with that, but this gets back to our discussion a few minutes ago about Zelensky. I think Zelensky, if he believes what he is saying, is seriously delusional. It's just hard to believe that he hasn't figured out by now where this train is headed and done everything he can to rescue the situation. But there's no evidence that he accepts facts the way I understand and you understand facts, or logic about, what is going on in the battlefield. It seems to me that this is all quite straightforward. I think for both of us, because we've talked about this over the years now, it's pretty straightforward where this one is headed. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what the balance of power looks like and what the trajectories are for both sides. But you have Zelensky, and I should add, you have all these people in the West as well, and in the mainstream media, who talk about the situation in ways that make me think that I'm living on a foreign planet. I sometimes wonder, am I here on planet Earth dealing with people who believes in facts and logic? I'm not sure I do. Right?
Well, yeah, I've had that. We've in recent shows shown some recent comments by Mark Rutte, the Secretary General for NATO, of Kaja Kallas, the Foreign Minister for the European Union. They're literally talking like this is the third or fourth month of the war, and it's still an open question as to whether the Ukraine side can win if they get enough stuff or whatever. And I do also wonder, how am I missing something? Do they know some secret information that I don't have? Because everything we've seen screams that they don't, and then you have to wonder, then why do they go? And that's the last question I want to ask you from the international theorist hat on. What is going to be the cost and the consequence, or what may be a better way to put it, if the war terminates the way we think, and Russia just finally just says, all right, y'all never did come up with a deal that we would agree to on paper, so we'll simply take by force of arms what we want, and we'll just say it's the Dnieper River because that's the most defensible military position. So let's say that they end up going there, and you have over 3 years of comments like Rutte, like Kallas, like Biden before him, and all of his national security folks, Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, they continue to say those kind of things. What is going to be the impact of all of those years of comments then exposed as being completely wrong? What does that do to Western Europe?
Well, I think there is no question that the reputational effects will be great. But reputation is just reputation. And one could argue that states, powerful states, and this would include countries like France, Germany, and Britain, can live with a damaged reputation, and time will solve that problem. But I actually think a good case can be made that this will do serious damage to NATO. Because you want to remember that if we lose this war, which seems highly likely, at least to us, if we lose this war, and Donald Trump is the president of the United States, you have a situation where Donald Trump, he'd like to get out of Europe. He has no use for the Europeans. He has no use for NATO. You can make a very good case that NATO will either crumble or it will be greatly weakened. And the question you have to ask yourself, especially if you're a European, is, do you want to see NATO greatly weakened? Do you think it really matters for security in Europe? And I think most Europeans believe that keeping NATO intact, keeping the Americans firmly committed to Europe, is of enormous importance for maintaining the peace in Europe. And that if Ukraine undermines the alliance in a meaningful way, that would be disastrous. So it's very hard to say exactly where this train is headed. But one could argue that the consequences of this will be very great for Europe, will be very great for NATO. I'll add just one final point, Danny. If you believe the greatest threat the United States faces is China and that we should be pivoting to Asia and containing China, one could make an argument that this would be all for the good. if the Americans got out of Europe and pivoted to Asia. That would be in America's strategic interest.
And let me just kind of add one more little caveat question onto that. If NATO exists to deter fighting, and it's supposed to be the most powerful and successful military alliance in the history of mankind, at the end of this, if it ends the way that I just described here at the Dnieper River, and Russia just saying, all right, this is our forward motion, where we're going, and now that we're going to build up a defense, who knows what they would end up doing there. But militarily, everything that NATO had done, all the stuff that Secretary Austin has bragged, and General Joe Biden had bragged so many times, that this conference that they had in Germany all the time in Ramstein, the Ramstein meetings was 50 nations. They always bragged about it, and we're going to impose all this stuff on Ukraine, on Russia. Ukraine's going to win, Russia's going to lose. That's the way it's going to have to be. And then we find out that everything NATO had, all of its weapon systems, all of its air defense capacity, even some of its jets, did squat. And Russia was able to defeat both the training, the manpower, the intelligence, and the physical weapons of war, the ammunition, all of that stuff. What does that do to the credibility of NATO?
It damages it greatly. It's a huge blow. Listen, you see a similar situation in the Middle East. Here you had a situation where Israel, by far the most powerful state in the region, right, armed with nuclear weapons, joined at the hip with the United States, went to war against Hamas. They said they were going to decisively defeat Hamas. Hamas was going to be wiped out. Look at the present situation today. Hamas is alive and well by Israeli accounts. Furthermore, it's the Israelis who said they weren't going to leave Gaza, especially northern Gaza, who are leaving all of Gaza and who have not defeated Hamas. They have suffered, the Israelis, a humiliating defeat, despite the fact that they were far more powerful than Hamas. And if you go to the situation in Ukraine, you had Ukraine backed by the mighty United States, backed by the West and East Europeans, up against what was initially a very weak Russian military. And in the end, the Russians rebuilt their military, and the Russians are now more powerful than they were at the start of the war, and the Russians are going to win. So it's a quite similar situation.
Well, and it's just a horrible situation because, as you said, you've been calling this literally for decades, and so much could have been avoided if just the least amount of rational thinking had been able to be employed at some of the higher levels in both Europe and the United States, but it wasn't. And now we're just going to have to wait and see if Trump can convince the Ukraine side, or whether he can take decisive action to say, all right, everything has been a disaster up to this point. We can either pretend that you're right and that you're going to be able to force Putin into something, and they'll keep going until they get to the Dnieper, or we can just give you, quote, a bad peace here, and the line might be only the 4 provinces. That's probably the best that can be hoped for right now. We'll have to wait and see whether that is doable by the West.
Yeah, let's hope my pessimism is wrong-headed and that things work out. Certainly for the Ukrainians, let's hope.
Yeah, you hadn't hardly been wrong since, I don't know, 2008. So your track record's not giving me a lot of optimism here for you being wrong this time. But I hope you are, for the sake of the Ukrainian people. But we'll have to wait and see how it works out. But in any case, thank you so much for coming on today and providing such clarity to this. And I'm sure we'll have you back on again soon, especially once we find out, once the Trump and Putin, or at least the U.S. and Russia meet together, and we get some kind of an idea of what outlines of this deal may be. We'll surely have you back on to discuss that.
Thank you, Danny. Always my pleasure to be with you and to talk about these depressing issues.
Always our pleasure too. Thanks a lot. And thank you also for being here today. Also, we're going to have a show here this afternoon on the clarity on a lot of Trump's military executive orders that he's been coming down, how that affects the military, what you can expect. Also, we're going to have a shorter show at about 2:30 this afternoon, where we're going to be talking about some of the reason for the decline of the mainstream media, why people aren't believing them. And we're going to center this around some stuff that a lot of the major media have been doing in trying to sabotage Tulsi Gabbard on the eve of the beginning of her confirmation hearings, which will start tomorrow. That will be at 2:30 today, and we'll see you at that second show too, and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.